So let's try to move to another topic that I think is the end of the day's topic. And I will be sharing part of this topic with Francesco Mattina, because he will also give the experience on the European Union and in particular the CPVO on this topic. So let's start with the concept of essentially derived varieties. And just to highlight, the main purpose of introducing this concept in the UPOV Convention was to facilitate the cooperation between breeders. So those breeders that use some of the traditional techniques of breeding, like crossing, and also companies or breeders that use new technologies. And in a way, I have to highlight breeders, whether from public research institute, private companies, cooperative of farmers that are breeders, they actually like to be able to use as many technologies that are available for them in the breeding programs. So let's look into what is provided under the UPOV Convention by the essentially derived varieties. So this concept was introduced under the 1991 Act of the UPOV Convention. And as you can see, the scope of the breeder's right to the protected variety extends also to essential derived varieties. What that means in practice is that, you know, there is the requirement of the authorization of the breeder for certain acts in relation to the propagating material of the variety. So that means if I want to produce a protected variety of wheat and I want to have access to that protected seed, I need the authorization of the breeder. And that will apply in relation to the protected variety. Then we also heard that there was one of the key benefits of the UPOV membership is the breeder's exemption, whereby all protected varieties that are available in the market could be used for further breeding without the authorization of the breeder. And I would like to highlight, I don't know if there is a pointer here, but if we look, the breeder's exemption has two parts. The first part relates to the development of a variety, let's say variety C, and for that, you don't need the authorization of the breeders of the protected varieties. Sometimes you have several of them in the breeding program. To develop variety C, in all cases, you don't need the authorization of the breeders of the protected varieties if the material is available in the market, okay? Then that applies to all cases, and for variety C, also to commercialize variety C, you don't need the authorization of those breeders that you use material, you know, even that this material was protected under plant breeders' rights. But there is one exception. The exception applies not to this part. Still in this part, you don't need the authorization of the breeder to attain an essentially derived variety. But the point is that for an essentially derived variety, you have used mainly one variety. This is why one of the key elements of the definition of essentially derived variety is that it has been predominantly derived from one variety. So that means the majority of the genetics of variety, let's say A, has been retained in this variety. And in this case, still you don't need the authorization of the breeder of variety A to develop variety C, but to commercialize variety C, only in this case you need the authorization of the breeder. I think, I don't know if I need to point. Yes. So here, just to describe, we have this situation with breeder 1 develops this, breeder 2 develops this variety using the initial protected variety to obtain variety B, and then to commercialize variety B, this breeder 2 will need the authorization of breeder 1. But if you would like to commercialize variety B as such, then you need also the authorization of breeder 2. Any question? I know it's a Not easy concept, and it's at the end of the day. But if there are any questions, please go ahead. Is it clear? Everybody's with me? Yes? Okay. Hello? Yes? Okay. So then I continue. Key question. Can an essentially derived variety be protected? Yes. So it will be the same conditions of protection as any other variety. So if Ms. Lely receives an application, and this application is an essentially derived variety, the same procedure that for any other variety, the same conditions of protection will apply. So novelty, distinctness, uniformity, and stability. Then the other question is that it's only if the initial variety is protected that then this dependency between the initial variety and the essentially derived variety exists. So if the initial variety is not protected, then it is not plausible to actually claim this authorization when you commercialize the essentially derived variety. So this is why when a country introduces legislation in accordance with the UPOV Convention, and that country has national breeding institutes that probably are developing these initial varieties, very important to protect them. Because if they are not protected, then someone can use that material and develop a new variety, and then it will not be possible to claim any remuneration. So there has been some UPOV guidance that has been developed in order to provide clarity to this concept, because the UPOV Convention has two elements that are quite important, and those elements have not been defined in the convention. So let's look into what led to the revision of the current guidance on essentially derived varieties. With the new breeding techniques, it's easier and more rapidly that you can actually develop new varieties from one single variety. And this is why, in order to maximize progress in breeding and to continue to provide incentives for all type of breeders and all type of breeding programs, it was important to ensure that this matter could be addressed in the guidance. So there was an exercise of quite a few years that had involved many, I would say, UPOV members and stakeholders in developing new guidance on this concept. And the new guidance, as you can see, since 2019 until 2023, this work was undertaken by several working groups, and they finally adopted a new guidance that now is being approved by the UPOV Council. So these are the definition of essentially derived variety under the UPOV Convention. As you can see, three main elements: predominantly derived, has to be clearly distinguishable, and then retains the essential characteristics of the initial variety. But let's look into also what the UPOV Convention explains as possible means to obtain essentially derived varieties. As you can see, you have back crossing, you have mutation. So you have different methods. The methods as such are a clear indication that there is predominantly derivation, but still it will be important to also come to the other elements of the definition of essentially derived variety. As you can see, there is some further explanations that are provided in the guidance. I will not go into the detail due to the time that we have available, but I just wanted to say in the presentation that will be distributed to the participants, I'm looking into the organizers, yes, they will be available, the presentations, yes. So you will get all the detailed information, but this is an attempt to provide explanation to the notion of predominantly derived. So the idea is that really it's almost the whole genome of the initial protected variety that is retained in an essentially derived variety. And in this regard, as you can see that there is some work that has been done by breeders associations to also determine some thresholds to have an indication of whether there is likelihood to have some evidence that this variety has been predominantly derived from the initial variety. There is also information about what happens in the situation of monoparental varieties. In the case of monoparental, so it could be the situation of mutations. You can imagine an apple mutation. It even could be a natural mutation or artificial mutations through radiation. So that could also lead to the creation of essentially derived varieties. There is also some explanation of what happens with multiparental varieties in the case that there is repeated back crossing. And in that case, you can go back to the initial protected variety. So I would like to say the key elements here is that it is important that the predominantly derived variety doesn't come from another variety that is not itself predominantly derived. So you can have a situation that you have an initial variety that is the basis to develop an essentially derived variety, but that initial variety is not protected. But the essentially derived variety, it is protected. And then someone else uses that essentially derived variety to develop another essentially derived variety. In this case, it will not be a dependency because the initial variety is not protected. Some expression of the essential characteristics, there are some elements to reflect upon what could be essential characteristics, because that notion is not defined in the UPOV convention. So from that point of view, as you can see, it could be even beyond characteristics that are considered for being characteristics suitable for the US. Some could be the US characteristics, like the color of the apple, but maybe in some cases it is not the case. So very important also that the notion of essential characteristic really takes into consideration the variety as a whole, and also the importance of those characteristics for all that have a role in the value chain. It could be essential from a farmer's, grower's perspective, distributor, or the seller of the variety. Another key element is the fact that it has to be distinguishable from the initial variety. So the notion of distinctness is the same one that applies for any other variety. Okay, this is a tricky one that really led to a lot of discussion, because it says on one side, the essentially derived variety retains the essential characteristics of the initial variety, but then also the convention says that if there are differences that come from the act of derivation, let's say the act of mutation, in this case, those differences should be disregarded. And those differences could, in some cases, be essential characteristic. So that means that at the end, it is possible that the essentially derived variety has some difference with the initial protected variety in relation to an essential characteristic, because that essential characteristic is a result of the act of derivation. This is very complicated, I know. But you see my point? That at the end, this was one of the key differences with the previous guidance on this topic, because the previous guidance said the essentially derived variety had to retain all characteristics, essential characteristics from the initial variety. And in the current guidance, it says that they could be that there are differences, and it could be more than one, could be few differences, but also those differences could include an essential characteristic if it is the result of the act of derivation. I know. So just to keep it in brief, the relationship between the differences, whether there is some situations where among breeders, there are questions whether a variety is essentially derived from the variety of another breeder. This is a matter for the breeders to discuss among themselves. And in that regard, the new guidance has just been recently adopted. There is still a need for experience in the implementation of this new guidance. There is an active, I will say, exercise to monitor what is the understanding among already the breeders community, because this is a matter essentially between breeders. And if there are any infringement cases among breeders, because it is felt that there are some different understanding, but in general, breeders know. They know if they have used the material of an initial protected variety. And in general, breeders also will find ways to find agreements among themselves, to find some license, cross-license, to have access mutually to their varieties, because like that they can continue to make progress in breeding. So I will end now this part of the presentation, because the matter will continue. It's an active process. I know it's a topic of interest in many countries, also future members of UPOV, and I hope you can participate in the conversation and the dialogue to further bring understanding on this important concept. Now I will give the floor to Francesco to share with us how in the CPBO they are dealing with one aspect of this concept.